My point is, Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland promised to shut down bank accounts of the Russian oligarchs, but none of them bank in Canada. Trudeau and Freeland promised to shut down Russian banking altogether, but not for oil that they sell to the world. Same with Joe Biden and the United States. Bizarrely, they have exempted oil and gas from any sanctions because Biden canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. It was one of his very first things he did upon taking office. And wouldn't you know it, those 800,000 barrels of oil a day would nicely displace the oil coming to the U.S. from Russia. But what are you going to do? Just stop driving? So they have to keep buying that Russian oil. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe use solar-powered cars and solar-powered planes or something. And maybe Ukraine should too or something. That's what Jem Psaki says.
On oil leases, what this actually justifies, in President Biden's view, is the fact that we need to reduce our dependence on foreign oil, on oil in general, and we need to look at other ways of having energy in our country and others. One of the interesting things, George, we've seen over the last week or so is that a number of European countries are recognizing they need to reduce their own reliance on Russian oil.
So that's America. It has always imported oil, but why would Canada buy oil from Russia too? And we have so much oil here. Well, not really, because Gerald Butts, Trudeau's right-hand man since they were in college together, who has somehow become polite company again despite his disgraceful, unethical, corrupt conduct during the SNC Lavalin scandal and his interference in the prosecution of a crime. How did he get back into the Ottawa polite company scene? I don't know. Well, remember that before he worked for Trudeau, he ran the World Wildlife Fund of Canada. And here's what he said about Canada's own pipeline projects to bring ethical Canadian oil from Alberta to the world. I'm going to show you two video clips. They were both about the Northern Gateway pipeline, which would have taken Alberta oil to Vancouver, which could then have been shipped on the world market to compete with Russia. But it applies to the two other pipelines that Trudeau and Butts killed too, including Energy East, which would have sent oil to Canada's largest refinery in St. John, New Brunswick, which instead buys its oil on the open market from places like Russia and Saudi Arabia. So here is Gerald Butts saying no more dirty Alberta oil.
Truth be told, we don't think there ought to be a carbon-based energy industry by the middle of this century. That's our policy in Canada, and it's our policy all over the world. You can choose to fight this fight on locking us into a high-carbon economy for 5 decades. And I think that's a very reasonable perspective to take. In fact, it's one we do take. So we think that the oil sands have been expanded too rapidly without a serious plan for environmental remediation in the first place. So that's why we don't think it's up to us to decide whether there should be another route for a pipeline, because the real alternative is not an alternative route, it's an alternative economy.
Oh, so no more dirty Alberta oil, but dirty Russian oil is fine. Here he is again.
We ought to have a robust sense of our own possibilities from an energy perspective. And to date, the national discussion on energy has almost been entirely circumscribed around fossil fuels. We have abundant sources of geothermal, solar, wind, hydro energy that aren't part of that conversation, so it ought to be a more balanced one.
Those are both clips from much longer anti-oil rants. You know, back then, that was about a decade ago, Butts worked for the World Wildlife Fund. That sounds pretty friendly, but they're actually as corrupt as they come. Millions of dollars in dark foreign money. Here's a document from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund back in 2008 when Butts was actually just getting going at the World Wildlife Fund. I've shown you this document before. It's their anti-oil sands battle plan. Page 11 shows the map of the oil sands projects and pipelines they plan to kill, and they did kill them. Page 12 is important. It shows you the various NGOs, Greenpeace, the Sierra Club. And in the top right, you can see Butts' own group, the World Wildlife Fund. $7 million a year, you can see. Page 24 shows what that's for, just jamming up the system, which they did. You know, I remember when the truckers were crowdfunding and Gerald Butts was all over the TV talking about dark money and foreign money and how it was going to corrupt Canadian politics. The joke is those were a ton of little $25 gifts from ordinary people. The vast majority of the givers were from Canada, and of course the money was seized. It wasn't given anyways. But that's called psychological projection, because Gerald Butts knows all about taking dark foreign money to mess around in Canadian politics. It's what he did at the World Wildlife Fund. And then he continued that work when he went to Ottawa as Trudeau's top aide. Say, who spent all sorts of money secretly fighting against oil and gas in the West? Some left-wing anti-oil groups for sure, like Greenpeace, you bet. But my point is, who funded them? Because you don't see Greenpeace campaigning against fracking in Russia or against really anything in China, the most polluted place in the world. Canada uses as much oil and gas as ever, but it's just imported now from Russia, Saudi Arabia, that kind of thing. So who is the hidden hand? Who's pouring in the dark money to kill the oil sands? Let's get back to Russia for a moment. Here's the former head of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, explaining that Russia and Gazprom were spending millions of dollars in anti-fracking and anti-drilling environmentalist campaigns in the West to stop, in particular, Europe from drilling its own natural gas. It had to be hidden donations, or it would be too obvious. People would react negatively to Russia trying to fight against Western oil and gas. But what a rate of return. They spend $50 million in fake eco-activism and sell $50 billion in Russian natural gas. That's a pretty good rate of return. So yeah, Gerald Butts accepted foreign money to fight against Canada's oil sands. And let me ask you, is there any other Canadian who has done as much to stop Canada's oil sands from being exported to Europe or Asia? Well, let me put it another way. Is there any Canadian who has done as much to help Vladimir Putin by keeping Canada out of action as an oil and gas competitor? Tovarich Butts, Comrade Butts, has done a very good job. He should be Putin's ambassador to Canada. He's earned it. That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.